I came to America 7 years ago and became a citizen 2 years ago. On this show, as you know, I often try to provide my perspective as a relative newcomer to the US and with someone providing a kind of outside pair of eyes. To be clear, America is an exceptional country and there is much to love about it. It's why I moved here. American democracy is a real thing and something that has been admired the world over. The Constitution, our free speech, the rule of law, the peaceful transfer of power throughout history up until 2020. But there are some examples of American exceptionalism that we should all be, in the political realm, a little less proud of. No other liberal democracy has a convoluted electoral college system like we do, the kind that allowed George W. Bush and Donald Trump to win despite both losing the popular vote. No other liberal democracy has a legislative filibuster where you need 60, not 51 votes out of 100 to pass a law. No one else gerrymanders their voting maps like we do in America, cutting districts into ridiculous shapes to give one party an advantage, often along racial lines. And very few countries still use this first-past-the-post voting system, which we use for most of our elections, as does admittedly the country I immigrated from, the UK. So this is probably the voting system you're most familiar with. Congressional candidate X wins because he or she got more votes than congressional candidate Y. It doesn't matter whether you win a majority of votes in your district, you just have to be ahead of the person in second place, and victory is yours. First-past-the-post isn't the most accurate reflection of the desire of the majority. Candidates can win seats even if a majority of voters in that district didn't vote for them, or worse, voted against them. How is that fair or democratic? Think about it. All the outdated systems I mentioned at the start tend to protect the same political minority, Republicans. The Electoral College at the presidential level, the filibuster at the Senate level, gerrymandering, and first-past-the-post voting at the state level. Even the Supreme Court, thanks to lifetime appointments, thanks to court packing, will likely have a conservative court for decades. Republican power is entrenched in this country via basically minority rule. They don't need a majority anymore. But take a look at what happened a few weeks ago in Alaska. Democrat Mary Peltola beat Sarah Palin, yes, that's Sarah Palin, in Alaska's special congressional election. She will be the first Democrat in nearly half a century to represent Alaska in the House. Disrupting that Republican dynasty, if you want to call it, became possible for Peltola in part because of Alaska's new ranked choice voting system, which is also used in Maine and in various local elections from New York to Utah. Here is how it works. Voters rank their preference of candidate. If no candidate wins a majority of the ballots, then the candidate with the fewest votes is eliminated. Voters whose first choice candidate was eliminated have their second preference votes counted, which continues until one candidate wins a majority of the votes. Republicans weren't happy when they lost that Alaska special election and went after ranked choice voting. A defeated Sarah Palin said this.
Nobody understood the convoluted, complicated voter suppression agenda that it is. Nobody understood that. Otherwise, Alaskans would never have said, yay, let's do that. There are about 14 really liberal enclaves across the country. Those 14 are the ones who have adopted this ranked choice voting. That should tell you something right there.
And GOP Senator Tom Cotton tweeted, ranked choice voting is a scam to rig elections. 60% of Alaska voters voted for a Republican, but thanks to a convoluted process and ballot exhaustion which disenfranchises voters, a Democrat won, in quote marks. Oh, the person with the most votes should win an election? Does that mean Cotton thinks Hillary Clinton should have been president in 2016? But look, there is a big argument over how to fix our elections and whether we should switch to ranked choice voting across the board. Republicans aren't that keen. Some progressives on the Democratic side, like Senator Elizabeth Warren, for example, are super keen. So we thought, why not debate it on the show today? Could this system better reflect the will of the voters rather than protect a powerful minority? Or would ranked choice just be another convoluted system for politicians to game? Joining me now to debate the merits of ranked choice voting, Zach Petkanas, Democratic strategist who supports the use of ranked choice voting, and on the other side of the issue, Damon Linker, senior fellow at the Niskanen Center. Thank you both for joining me. Zach, just very briefly, basically to the point, make the case for ranked choice voting.
Absolutely. I mean, so first off, I just need to say that in terms of reforms to our system, ranked choice voting is not at the very tippy top of my list. It comes well below a number of the reforms that you mentioned, like abolishing the Electoral College and eliminating the filibuster, as the things that you mentioned. But I do think it should be considered in the coterie of reforms that we need to safeguard democracy. And for me, the reason is pretty simple. We have a growing extremist and some would say fascist movement in this country. And our current system says that an extremist candidate or an extremist party with a committed group of followers can obtain power with 45, 40, 35% of the vote if the rest of the electorate is divided. And I think it's really important to be able to counter that. And ranked choice voting is one of the ways that it can do that. It forces the kind of coordination between mainstream parties in order to block the extremists. And that's really important because one of the ways that fascist and extremist movements have been able to take power is by taking advantage of the inability of mainstream parties to coordinate effectively to block them. And we saw that worked in Alaska.
Damon, it's a way of stopping an extremist minority from gaming the system, from getting ahead with minority rule. What's not to like about it?
Well, my only objection to it is the part that gets at the name instant runoff voting. That's kind of the other thing that ranked choice voting is often called. And that's a way of trying to take a system where you have an open primary and no one wins 50% of the vote, as you explained in your opening segment. And then instead of holding a second separate round where, let's say, the top two finishers go at each other, and then inevitably one of those two is going to win 50% because there are only two left. Instead of that, you do the thing that you explained where the voters have to rank all of their choices, and then different rounds of counting and reallocation of votes take place. And that's the problem. The big problem in America today that is behind a lot of our degrading political systems has to do with a genuine skepticism or distrust that people have in our institutions of voting and government. And giving more power to people behind the scenes to do this vote reallocation is just going to, I think, inspire a lot of conspiracy theorizing and the kinds of nonsense that you heard Sarah Palin talking about in the little clip that you showed. So I have a suggestion for something that might be a little bit better, but maybe we'll come back to that.
Zach, what's wrong with having a runoff like they have in France, for example, in the presidential election? And what would you say to people who say the system you're proposing, ranked choice voting, is too complicated, too convoluted for the average American voter?
So first off, I have no problem with a number of the solutions here. What I do know is that the current system allows for extremist candidates to obtain power without getting a majority of the vote, and that's something we need to be very watchful of right now. But in terms of the question of whether it's too complicated, we don't need to theorize about this. We can just ask the voters what they think about it in places where they use it. And a poll that was taken in 2021 after the New York City mayoral primary, in which it was used, 95% of voters found the ballot, quote, simple to complete, unquote. In Alaska, 85% of Alaskans reported that it was, quote, simple, unquote. It doesn't, some of the other suggestions has been that it undermines turnout, that it lowers turnout because it's too complicated. We know this is not the case either. In Maine, for example, where they used ranked choice voting in 2018 and 2020, turnout was significantly higher than in similar elections. In New York City, in the June primary in 2021 that I mentioned, more than 1 million people came out to vote compared to just over 770,000 in 2013, the last time there was an open mayoral primary. Okay. And so I think voters are smarter than we give them credit for. And if we want to know how they feel about it, we should ask them. We have, and they like it.
Damon, if you look at New York's primary in the 10th district, some might say it is the ideal, the perfect argument for ranked choice voting. You look there, Dan Goldman, quote unquote, centrist candidate, wins the election very narrowly. The progressive vote split 3 ways between candidates Yulene New, Mondaire Jones, and Carlina Rivera. With ranked choice voting, surely the progressive majority in that district would have won that seat. One of their candidates would have won almost undoubtedly. What do you say to people in that district who say, give us ranked choice voting so we can actually be represented by a candidate we want?
Well, again, the problem for me has to do with the attempt to skip an actual runoff. In a case like that, I think it would be much better for to have the first round. It shows up with the results that you had up on the screen, and then you run a second round vote and have the top two candidates go after each other. And if ranked choice voting is valid, then you should end up getting the same results that other way, where the three progressive candidates all coalesce behind the leading progressive option and end up winning. The only difference between those two approaches is that in the one that I'm advocating, there isn't any kind of behind the scenes reallocation of votes that then demagogues on the right and potentially the left, but in our case so far, usually on the right, can come out and say there's some secret shenanigans going on behind the scenes.
David.
And I don't think that that's usually going to be true, but I do think that it happens a lot, and we have to respond to that reality.
I'm sorry to disappoint you, Damon, but whatever system you come up with, there'll be people on the right who claim all sorts of crazy conspiracies. Let me ask you this, Zach. You mentioned at the start, this isn't the top of your list. What is the top of your list? Give me your three top. If you had the magical power to change, or some would say fix, American democracy, what top three things would you do? And then I'll get Damon to respond before we finish.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I think there are a number of anachronisms that we just hold to be the way things are. One is the Electoral College, which is Electoral College, and I give you Donald Trump as the example of why that's a problem. Two is eliminating the filibuster, which has creating these unnecessary chokeholds within the democratic process. And three is gerrymandering to make sure that the House is more representative of the population. Those would be my top three with a magic wand.
Damon, when I look around America right now, everywhere, at the state level, at the Supreme Court level, at the federal level, presidential, Republicans are winning through minority rule. They are winning without a majority of the public.
That's true, and it's a huge problem. I do think that some of it is a little contingent. I mean, the fact that Republicans now have a kind of lock on winning so many states in the Electoral College and in the Senate is a function of how their electoral coalition is interacting with these institutions.
Yeah.
That was not true during Obama's campaigns, for example. He won quite well and had efficient electoral coalitions that way. We also can't just get rid of the Electoral College without getting buy-in from Republicans, and so I think that's not going to happen.
Yes.
I'm all in favor of getting rid of, limiting partisan gerrymandering. I think that would be a fabulous thing to do to fix our system. And then when it comes to the filibuster, yeah, in theory, I like that idea, but we have to be clear that it's also the case that whichever party's in the minority is going to benefit from that. So if the Republicans take a sweeping majority in either 2022 or 2024, believe me, Democrats will be very happy to have veto power of the filibuster on that Senate majority.